The early morning sun had barely crept over the Los Angeles skyline when Snoop Dogg's phone buzzed with a message he hadn't expected. It was short and to the point. "You have been subpoenaed to appear in court today. Be there by 9 a.m. Snoop stared at the message, his mind racing. A courtroom appearance was the last thing he'd anticipated when he woke up this morning. But as he scrolled through his phone, a flood of notifications revealed a storm brewing, one that had his name written all over it. Rumors had already started to swirl online. Headlines blared about Snoop Dogg's supposed connection to the latest scandal that had Diddy's name in every blog and every radio station's gossip segment. The talk was of clandestine meetings, money changing hands, and shady backroom deals. Snoop had always been at the center of attention, but this was different. This was bigger. This was messy. And this was public. He flicked his phone away, rose from his chair, and took a long look in the mirror. Dressed in his usual laid-back style, crisp white t-shirt under an open flannel, thick gold chains resting against his chest, he gave himself a nod. The calm he radiated was almost eerie, like he'd been here 1,000 times before. He was Snoop Dogg, after all. He was no stranger to the chaos of the public eye. But even he knew that a courtroom summons was more than a publicity stunt. It was real, and it had real consequences. As he walked out to the blacked-out SUV waiting at the curb, his manager, Tyrese, was already on the phone, barking instructions to their legal team. "We need everything, Tyrese," Snoop said, his voice low but firm. "I want to know exactly what's going on before I set foot in that courtroom." Tyrese nodded, phone glued to his ear, eyes darting back to Snoop. "We got you, boss," he said, though there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there yesterday. The ride to the courthouse felt like it took a lifetime. Every street corner seemed to have a camera, every intersection packed with fans who'd caught wind of the unfolding drama. Snoop stared out the window, watching as people held up their phones, snapping pictures and streaming live to whoever would watch. The world was waiting for answers, and Snoop had become the center of the story. When they finally arrived, the scene outside the courthouse was electric. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. Fans crowded behind metal barricades, chanting his name and shouting out questions he couldn't begin to answer. Snoop took a deep breath, exhaling a cloud of calm determination, and stepped out of the SUV. The moment his foot hit the pavement, the crowd erupted in a frenzy of camera flashes and overlapping voices. He didn't flinch. He didn't stop to pose or wave. He just walked, head held high, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors ahead. The air of mystery that had always surrounded him was only amplified by the gravity of the situation. Every step he took seemed to echo through the buzzing crowd. Inside the courthouse, the air was cooler, quieter, but the tension was just as thick. Snoop's legal team, a trio of sharp-suited lawyers, huddled around him, their faces grave. "We're working on a motion to quash the subpoena," one of them said, voice low. "But with the way this is playing out in the press, I wouldn't count on it." Snoop nodded once, his calm exterior unshaken. "Let's do what we have to," he said. "I'll handle the rest." The courtroom was already filling up as they entered. Rows of wooden benches were packed with journalists, fans, and curious onlookers, their eyes wide and hungry for the drama they knew was about to unfold. Snoop walked down the center aisle, his presence commanding the room. Whispers rose up around him, but he didn't break his stride. At the front of the room, the judge sat stone-faced behind the bench, her eyes scanning the courtroom with the practiced detachment of someone who had seen it all before. She gave no sign of favor or interest as Snoop took his seat, flanked by his lawyers. Across the room, Diddy's team sat in a tight cluster, their heads bent together in intense conversation. Diddy himself was nowhere to be seen, a fact that only fueled the fevered speculation in the room. As the bailiff called the court to order, the hush that fell over the room was immediate and total. The judge's voice was calm and even as she addressed the courtroom, but there was no mistaking the underlying gravity in her tone. "Today," she said, "we will hear testimony that could have far-reaching consequences. I expect decorum. I expect respect. And I will not tolerate any disruptions." Snoop leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. He knew how to play the long game. He knew that sometimes the quietest person in the room held the most power. The whispers around him faded to a background hum, and he allowed himself a brief smile. He was ready. The judge's gavel struck the wood, and the first witness was called. It wasn't Snoop, yet. But every word spoken seemed to circle back to him, like the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for the moment he would take the stand. The prosecutor's questions, the witnesses' careful answers. It all felt like a warm-up act for the main event. Outside the courthouse, the media circus had only grown wilder. News vans lined the street, their antennas reaching skyward like grasping fingers. Headlines scrolled across TV screens in real time. Snoop Dogg subpoenaed in Diddy scandal. What does he know? Social media was a feeding frenzy, each post more breathless than the last. But inside, Snoop remained a study in control. When the court adjourned for a brief recess, Tyrese leaned over. "They are going to call you next," he said, his voice tight. "Are you sure you're ready?" Snoop gave him a look that said everything and nothing at once. "I was born ready," he said quietly. As he stood up and walked toward the courtroom doors, the crowd parted like water around him. His stride was easy, confident, as if he were walking onto a stage instead of a witness stand. But in his eyes, there was a glint of steel, a determination that said he wasn't just here to play a part. He was here to set the record straight. The moment Snoop stepped back into the courtroom, the whispers started again. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched across notepads. And Snoop, with the calm of someone who had faced down bigger storms than this, took his place at the front of the room. He rested his hands lightly on the railing of the witness stand and looked out at the sea of faces, each one waiting for him to speak. The judge raised her gavel, and in that split second before it fell, Snoop locked eyes with Diddy's team. He could see the unease in their eyes, the tension in their posture. This was no ordinary day in court. This was the beginning of a story that would be told and retold for years to come. And as the gavel fell, Snoop Dogg knew that whatever happened next, he was ready to meet it head-on. As Snoop Dogg settled back into his seat, the courtroom around him seemed to vibrate with a mix of excitement and unease. The morning's testimony had already been electric, but everyone knew the real drama was about to begin. Snoop could see the journalists perched like vultures on the edge of their seats, their pens poised, their eyes glinting with the promise of headlines and breaking news. Social media updates flashed across phone screens, each one more breathless than the last. The buzz was undeniable. Tyrese leaned in, his phone in hand. "They are talking about you everywhere," he whispered. "It's trending worldwide. Everyone's speculating what you're gonna say." Snoop just nodded, his face giving nothing away. He wasn't new to the game. He knew how to play it, slow, steady, and always a step ahead. But even he couldn't ignore the way the courtroom seemed to close in around him, the air charged like a live wire. Across the room, Diddy's team sat rigid and silent. His lead lawyer, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, kept his gaze locked on Snoop like a hawk tracking its prey. Every flicker of expression, every shift in Snoop's posture was being catalogued and assessed. Diddy himself still hadn't shown up, a fact that only fueled the speculation outside. Where was he? Was he watching from somewhere else, or was he just waiting to make his grand entrance? Meanwhile, the journalists were in a frenzy. Microphones were passed from hand to hand, cameras adjusted to get the best angle. Even the bailiff seemed tense, his eyes flicking to the doors every few seconds, as if expecting something, or someone, to burst through at any moment. As the judge called the court back into session, a hush fell over the room. She surveyed the crowd with a practiced calm that had been honed over decades on the bench. "I will remind everyone again," she said, her voice steady and measured, "that this is a courtroom, not a circus. Any disruptions will not be tolerated." "Understood." A murmur of assent rippled through the spectators, but the excitement in their eyes told another story. They were here for the drama, and they wouldn't leave disappointed. Snoop's legal team shifted in their seats, each lawyer ready to spring into action if needed. They knew this wasn't just about legal strategy, it was about controlling the narrative. Tyrese was on his phone, scrolling through the endless feed of speculation and rumor. "They're saying you're the key to everything," he muttered, showing Snoop the screen. Headlines blazed. Snoop Dogg, the man who knows too much. And what will Snoop reveal? The world holds its breath. Snoop leaned back, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. He was no stranger to the spotlight, but this was something else. He could feel the weight of every camera lens trained on him, every reporter's notepad filled with half-truths and guesses. But he wasn't here for them. He was here to speak his truth, or at least his version of it. The courtroom doors opened again, and a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd as Diddy finally appeared. He walked in slowly, head held high, his expression carefully neutral. But there was no mistaking the tension in his shoulders or the tightness around his mouth. He wore a dark suit, crisp and immaculate, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man used to being in control. But today, that control was slipping. Diddy didn't glance at Snoop as he took his seat across the aisle, but the air between them seemed to crackle with an invisible current. The judge gave him a curt nod before turning her attention back to the proceedings. "Let's proceed," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The first witness of the afternoon was a music executive, someone who'd been there in the background of every major deal and negotiation. He spoke carefully, each word measured, but his eyes kept darting towards Snoop, as if he were afraid of what might come next. His testimony was polite, professional, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of tension. It felt like everyone in the room was dancing around something, waiting for the moment the truth, or at least a version of it, would finally be spoken out loud. When the judge finally called a recess, the room exploded into noise. Reporters scrambled for the exits, racing to file updates. Tyrese leaned over again, his brow furrowed. "They are saying your testimony could blow this whole thing wide open," he said. "They think you're gonna take it from rumor to reality." Snoop just nodded, his face a mask of calm. Let them talk, he thought. Let them guess. When the time came, they'd know exactly what he wanted them to know. Outside, the courthouse steps were a scene of barely contained chaos. Cameras flashed, fans chanted, and reporters shouted questions into the void. News anchors broadcast live from every angle, their voices breathless with excitement. "It's a media circus out there," Tyrese said as he peered out the window. "They are calling this the trial of the decade." Snoop just smiled faintly, a flicker of amusement breaking through the calm. "Let them watch," he said quietly. "I've got nothing to hide." But even as he said it, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. This wasn't just a show. This was his life, his reputation, and the legacy he'd spent decades building. And in the middle of it all was a story no one was sure they wanted to hear, the truth about Diddy's scandal, and Snoop's role in it. As the recess ended and the judge called them back to order, the courtroom once again fell silent. Snoop could feel every eye in the room trained on him, every breath held in anticipation. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. This was the moment when the whispers would become a roar. The judge's gaze swept across the room before settling on Snoop. "Mr. Broadus," she said, her voice steady, "please take the stand." Snoop rose slowly, every inch of him radiating calm. He walked to the witness stand with the easy confidence of someone who'd lived his whole life under the glare of the spotlight. The air in the room seemed to grow tighter with every step, until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. He took his seat, folded his hands in front of him, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. For a moment, everything was still. The courtroom, the cameras, the world outside. It all seemed to pause, waiting for him to speak. And then Snoop Dogg, the man who had seen it all, took a deep breath and prepared to tell his story. The courtroom was utterly silent as Snoop Dogg leaned forward in the witness box. The judge watched him closely, her expression calm but her eyes bright with curiosity. The lawyers on both sides sat poised, their pens ready to scratch out notes that could make or break their cases. Outside the courthouse, reporters were glued to their screens, ready to blast every word he said to the world. Snoop cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice low and deliberate. "I wasn't planning on being here today," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Diddy. "But sometimes, you don't get to choose when the truth comes knocking." There was a collective inhale, the room bracing for what would come next. Snoop's tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was a weight behind his words that no one could deny. It was the kind of weight that only came from years in the game, from the knowledge that once you started talking, you couldn't take it back. "You all know me," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I've been around a long time. I've seen things most people only hear about in rumors. But what I'm about to tell you, it ain't no rumor. It's real." The prosecutor leaned forward, her pen poised. "Mr. Broadus," she said, her voice measured, "please explain what you mean by that." Snoop nodded slowly. "See, everyone wants to talk about what's on the surface, who said what, who did what. But no one ever wants to talk about what's underneath. The deals. The favors. The things that happen behind closed doors." As he spoke, he could see Diddy stiffen across the room. The mogul's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were locked on Snoop with a look that was part disbelief and part challenge. It was as if he couldn't quite believe that Snoop was really going to go there. Snoop didn't flinch. He met Diddy's gaze head-on, unblinking. "You and me, Diddy," he said, his voice soft but clear. "We've shared a lot of stages, a lot of success, but we've also shared a lot of secrets. And today, I'm done keeping them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the spectators exchanging looks of shock and fascination. The judge raised a hand, and the room fell silent once more. Mr. Broadus, she said, her tone firm, please proceed with your testimony. Snoop nodded. He leaned back slightly, as if settling into a story he'd told 1,000 times in his mind but never out loud. A few years back, he said, his voice steady, there was a night. One of those big industry parties, the kind where everyone's there, artists, producers, execs, you name it. And that night, something went down that changed everything. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. And what was that? She asked. Snoop's eyes darkened, the memory flickering across his face. Diddy and me, we had a meeting. Private. Away from the cameras, away from the music. We talked about a deal that wasn't supposed to be public. But it was real. Money changed hands. Promises were made. A gasp echoed through the courtroom, a collective breath of disbelief. Diddy's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection, he barked. This is speculation, hearsay at best. The judge didn't waver. Overruled, she said calmly. Continue, Mr. Broadus. Snoop's lawyer shot him a glance, a subtle question in his eyes. Was he sure he wanted to keep going? Snoop nodded almost imperceptibly. He was sure. More sure than he'd ever been. Like I said, Snoop continued, his tone measured, this wasn't about music. This was about power. Control. Diddy wanted something only I could give him. And I gave it to him, because that's how this game works. But I never thought it would come to this. His voice grew quieter, the intensity of the moment pulling everyone in. It wasn't just about the deal, he said. It was about what came after. The cover-ups. The stories that had to be buried. The people who got hurt along the way. Across the room, Diddy sat motionless, his expression a mask. But his eyes, they told a different story. There was a flicker of uncertainty there, a crack in the facade that only someone who knew him as well as Snoop did could see. The prosecutor pressed on. Are you saying that Mr. Combs engaged in illegal activity? She asked. Snoop hesitated for a moment, the weight of his words heavy in the air. I'm saying, he said slowly, that there are things he doesn't want the world to know. Things that go way deeper than anyone's ever guessed. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Phones buzzed as journalists dashed off updates, their fingers flying over keyboards. Tyrese shot Snoop a look that was half pride, half fear. This was it. The line had been crossed. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Broadus, do you have evidence of these claims? She asked. Snoop's eyes flickered, a hint of something cold and hard there. I do, he said softly. But that's for later. Right now, I'm just telling you what I saw, what I was part of. The prosecutor sat back, satisfied for the moment. The defense lawyer, meanwhile, looked like he was about to explode. This is outrageous, he sputtered. This is nothing but an attempt to smear my client's name. The judge held up a hand. You will have your chance to respond, she said calmly. But for now, Mr. Broadus will continue. Snoop drew a breath, his eyes scanning the room again. People think they know me, he said. They think they know what I'm about. But the truth is, I've been holding on to these secrets for too long. Today, I'm done holding back. The finality in his voice sent a shiver through the room. There was no turning back now. Whatever he said next would echo far beyond the walls of this courtroom. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was as heavy as a lead weight, pressing down on everyone in the room. And then, with a slow exhale, Snoop leaned forward again. I'm not here to start a war, he said. But I'm done playing the game. And if that means telling the truth, even if it hurts, then that's what I'm gonna do. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. We'll hear more in the next session, she said, her gavel coming down with a sharp crack. Court is adjourned for the day. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the buzz outside only grew louder. Headlines were already being drafted. The world was waiting for the next revelation, the next twist in a story that was only just beginning. And Snoop Dogg, calm, collected, and ready, knew he was the only one who could tell it. The following day dawned heavy with anticipation. The courthouse steps were already swarming with reporters when Snoop Dogg and his team arrived. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every inch of his calm, deliberate stride as he stepped from the SUV. Tyrese was close behind, his phone pressed to his ear, feeding updates to their legal team and scanning social media for every rumor and whisper. The air was electric, thick with the promise of revelations that would shake the music world to its core. Inside the courtroom, the tension was even more palpable. Spectators filled every available seat, their eyes locked on the witness box where Snoop was set to take the stand again. The murmurs of speculation died away as the judge entered, and the room fell silent under her steady gaze. "Mr. Broadus," she began, "you may continue your testimony." Snoop rose, every movement measured and deliberate. He paused for a moment, glancing around the room, his expression unreadable. Then he settled into the witness chair, leaned forward, and began to speak. "Yesterday, I told you there was more to the story," he said, his voice low and even. "Today, I'm going to tell you about the meetings, the ones no one wants to talk about." A collective shiver ran through the crowd. Diddy's lawyer shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, eyes locked on Snoop with a mixture of disbelief and dread. "It was late," Snoop continued, his tone calm, almost reflective. "One of those nights when the city never sleeps. We met in a back room of a club, somewhere the cameras couldn't reach. Just me and Diddy. No entourage. No noise. Just two men talking about the kind of business no one's supposed to hear about." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. The prosecutor leaned forward. "And what was discussed in that meeting?" she asked. Snoop's gaze flickered, a memory flashing behind his eyes. "It was about more than money," he said. "It was about control. About making sure certain stories never saw the light of day. We talked about favors, who owed who, and how those debts would be paid." A gasp rippled through the room. The idea of Snoop and Diddy, two of the biggest names in the industry, huddled in secret, making deals in the shadows, it was the stuff of tabloid fever dreams, but here it was, laid out in stark detail. Diddy's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection," he barked. "This is nothing but conjecture and hearsay." The judge's gaze was cool and unflinching. "Overruled," she said. "Mr. Broadus, continue." Snoop leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Diddy's. "We talked about a project," he said. "A big one. Something that was supposed to change everything. But there were strings attached. Promises made in that room that were never meant to be broken." He paused, his words sinking in like stones in water. "I wasn't the only one in those meetings," he added. "There were others. People who would do anything to keep their names out of the headlines. People who were willing to pay to make sure certain truths stayed buried." A murmur spread through the courtroom, like a wave breaking against the shore. Journalists scribbled furiously, their faces lit with the thrill of scandal. Even the judge seemed to lean in just a fraction, her eyes locked on Snoop as he continued. "Diddy and I, we were partners in this. But it wasn't the kind of partnership you see in the press," he said. "It was built on secrets, on knowing exactly how far the other would go to protect what they had." He paused, his voice softening as he looked out over the room. "People think the music industry is all lights and cameras," he said. "But behind the scenes, it's a different game entirely. One where the stakes are higher and the price of losing is everything." Across the aisle, Diddy sat stone-faced, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, a memory, perhaps, or a fear he couldn't quite hide. His lawyer leaned close, whispering urgently in his ear, but Diddy didn't move. He just stared at Snoop, the silence between them louder than any shout. The prosecutor's voice cut through the hush. "Mr. Broadus, are you saying that Mr. Combs threatened you or others to keep this hidden?" she asked. Snoop's eyes narrowed. "I'm saying he didn't have to," he said. "When you're in that room, you know the rules. You know what's expected of you, and what happens if you break those expectations." The weight of his words hung in the air, the courtroom a tableau of frozen faces. Outside, the buzz of reporters and fans only grew louder, each new detail feeding the fire of speculation and gossip. The judge shifted in her seat. "Mr. Broadus," she said, her voice careful, "do you have any physical evidence of these meetings?" Snoop hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded slowly. "I do," he said. "But it's not just papers or contracts. It's recordings. Conversations that were never supposed to be heard outside those four walls." A collective gasp erupted in the room. Even Diddy's lawyer looked rattled, his face blanching as he scrambled to object. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted. "This is outrageous. We demand to see this supposed evidence." The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. "You will have your chance," she said evenly. Mr. Broadus, do you have these recordings in your possession? Snoop nodded again, his face calm. I do, he said. And when the time is right, I'll play them. Because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The courtroom was electric with tension. Tyrese, watching from the sidelines, looked like he could barely breathe. The journalists were already drafting the next round of headlines in their heads. Snoop's secret tapes. What will they reveal? As the judge adjourned the session for the day, the room erupted into a storm of voices. Reporters surged forward, their cameras trained on Snoop as he rose from the stand. He didn't flinch, didn't rush. He walked slowly and deliberately, every inch of him radiating the calm of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Outside, the world waited for the next revelation. And Snoop Dogg, standing in the center of the storm, knew that this was only the beginning. As the courtroom buzzed with the echoes of Snoop's testimony, the air felt tighter than ever. Even the thick walls seemed to vibrate with the tension. Diddy sat at his table, his face an impassive mask, but there was no mistaking the way his fingers tapped a relentless rhythm on the polished wood. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but Diddy's eyes were locked on Snoop like a predator watching its prey. When the judge called the court back into session, the murmurs and whispers faded, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Diddy's lawyer stood, straightening his suit and squaring his shoulders as he addressed the court. Your Honor, we move to strike Mr. Broadus's testimony as hearsay and speculation, he said, his voice crisp with barely restrained outrage. The judge didn't even blink. Your motion is noted and denied, she said, her tone calm but final. Mr. Broadus's testimony will stand. You may cross-examine the witness. The lawyer gave a tight nod and turned his sharp gaze on Snoop. Mr. Broadus, he began, his voice dripping with condescension, you've painted quite the picture. Backroom meetings. Secret deals. But where's the proof? Do you expect this court to take your word over documented facts? Snoop met his gaze steadily. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, he said. I'm just telling you what I saw. What I lived. The lawyer's lips thinned. Convenient, he said. But you've admitted you don't have those recordings here today. Until you produce them, your testimony is nothing but empty talk. Snoop's calm didn't falter. The truth don't need a show, he said. It speaks for itself. And when the time's right, those recordings will speak too. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the tension growing by the second. Diddy shifted in his seat, his expression tightening, eyes narrowing as if he was trying to bore holes into Snoop with sheer force of will. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away, just them and the unspoken history that crackled in the space between. The lawyer tried again, his voice growing sharper. Isn't it true, Mr. Broadus, that you and my client have had your own disputes over the years? Disputes that might color your testimony here today. Snoop's mouth twitched in a half-smile. You're damn right we've had our differences, he said, his voice steady. But this ain't about old beef. This is about what's real. What happened when the cameras were off and the deals were made? The lawyer pressed on, voice rising in frustration. Or maybe this is about publicity, he snapped. A chance to grab the spotlight at the expense of my client's reputation. Snoop shook his head, slow and deliberate. I don't need the spotlight, he said. I've been in it my whole life. This is about setting the record straight. About telling the truth, no matter how messy it gets. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers, reporters scribbling notes as fast as they could. The judge rapped her gavel, restoring order, her eyes flicking from Snoop to Diddy and back again. As the cross-examination continued, Diddy sat like a statue, his face betraying nothing. But his fingers never stopped drumming on the table, a silent staccato beat that spoke louder than words. Tyrese watched from the sidelines, his phone clutched in his hand, eyes darting between the two men as if he could feel the stakes in every breath. The lawyer tried to discredit Snoop, digging up old headlines, past controversies. But Snoop stood firm, his answers calm and measured, each word cutting through the lawyer's barbs like a blade. I've made mistakes, he admitted. I've lived my life in the public eye. But this, what I'm talking about today, it's bigger than me. It's about the truth. Finally, the lawyer seemed to sense he was getting nowhere. With a sigh of frustration, he stepped back. No further questions, he said tightly, his face flushed with barely hidden anger. The judge turned to Diddy. Mr. Combs, she said, her tone even, you have the right to respond. Do you wish to take the stand? For a moment,
Diddy said nothing.
The silence stretched, the entire room waiting to see what he would do.
Then, slowly, he rose to his feet.
"I will," he said, his voice low but resolute. As he walked to the stand, the air seemed to crackle around him. He moved with the smooth confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in control, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He settled into the chair, adjusted the microphone, and fixed the courtroom with a gaze that was as cold as it was commanding. When the defense lawyer began his questioning, Diddy's answers were clipped and precise.
"No," he said to the first question.
"That never happened," to the second. His tone was calm, but there was a flicker of heat behind his eyes, an anger that threatened to break through at any moment. "Mr. Combs," the prosecutor said, her voice careful but firm, "you've heard Mr. Broaddus's testimony. Are you saying he lied under oath?"
Diddy's lips tightened.
"I'm saying he's mistaken," he said slowly.
"There were no secret deals. No hidden meetings.
Anything he says to the contrary is false." Snoop watched him from the witness stand, his face expressionless.
But inside, he could feel the old battle lines being drawn.
This wasn't just about what was said in court, it was about whose story the world would believe. As Diddy continued to deny everything, the judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She was the one person in the room who wasn't swayed by headlines or rumor. She would decide what the truth was, and her verdict would echo far beyond these four walls.
Finally, the judge raised her hand.
"That's enough for today," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll resume tomorrow." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted into a storm of voices. Reporters flooded the aisles, their questions blending into a roar of noise. Diddy stood, his face tight, and walked back to his seat without a glance at Snoop. Tyrese moved quickly to Snoop's side, his voice low and urgent. "They're already twisting it out there," he said. "Everyone's got their own version."
Snoop just nodded.
"Let them talk," he said, his voice steady.
"I know what I saw.
And I know what's coming next." Outside, the world waited, hungry for the next chapter in a story that was far from over. The following day dawned with the same electric energy that had gripped the city since the trial began. Outside the courthouse, a forest of microphones and cameras waited for Snoop Dogg and Diddy to arrive. Fans and critics alike lined the barricades, their voices a mix of cheers and jeers. Headlines blared across every screen. "The smoking gun, will Snoop deliver?" It was the kind of tension that even the music industry had never seen before. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was a mix of hushed anticipation and simmering anxiety. Tyrese sat beside Snoop, his phone clutched like a lifeline, his eyes scanning the feeds that seemed to update by the second.
"It's all anyone's talking about," he murmured.
"They're saying today's the day you'll either end this or blow it wide open." Snoop said nothing, his gaze steady on the front of the room. He'd spent the night reviewing the tapes, the recordings that had the power to shift the ground beneath them. His mind replayed every whispered word, every tense moment, until it was as clear as if he were back in that dimly lit room with Diddy all over again. The judge entered, her presence instantly calming the buzzing whispers that had filled the room. She surveyed the courtroom, her eyes lingering for a moment on Snoop, then on Diddy, who sat with his lawyer in a show of icy composure. "Mr. Broaddus," she said, "you indicated yesterday that you have evidence to support your testimony.
Are you prepared to present it today?"
Snoop stood, his movements deliberate, and nodded once. "I am, Your Honor," he said, his voice low but clear.
A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire.
Diddy's lawyer shot to his feet, his face flushed with urgency. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked.
"We have not seen this supposed evidence.
We object to its introduction without proper vetting." The judge held up a hand. "You will have your opportunity to review and respond," she said calmly. "Mr. Broaddus, please proceed." Snoop reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small USB drive. He held it up, the tiny device looking almost insignificant in his large hand. "This," he said, "contains recordings of conversations that happened behind closed doors. Conversations that back up every word I've said." The hush that fell over the courtroom was total. Even the journalists, usually so quick to chatter and speculate, sat frozen, their pens poised in midair. Diddy's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he stared at the USB drive with a look that was equal parts disbelief and fury. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who stepped forward to collect the drive and hand it to the clerk. A large monitor was wheeled forward, its screen flickering to life as the first recording loaded. Snoop leaned back slightly, his face calm, his eyes locked on Diddy across the room. The first voice to fill the room was unmistakably Diddy's, smooth, confident, with the easy charm of a man used to getting his way. "We're talking about leverage here," he said on the recording. "You know how this game works. You do this for me, I do that for you. Nobody needs to know." The words hung in the air like a bomb, their impact shattering the calm veneer of the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the spectators, and the journalists nearly fell over themselves to scribble every word. Diddy's lawyer turned to him, his face pale. "We need to stop this," he hissed, but Diddy just stared at the screen, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched in his cheek. The recording continued. Snoop's voice came next, steady and measured. "I'll do it," he said. "But if this goes south, I'm not taking the fall alone. We're in this together, you and me." The silence that followed was deafening. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, every eye trained on Diddy as he sat stone-faced, his fingers drumming that same relentless rhythm on the table. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Combs," she said evenly, "do you have a response to this recording?" Diddy's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, we object to the authenticity of this recording," he said quickly. "We demand an independent analysis before it can be considered credible evidence." The judge nodded. "That will be arranged," she said. "But for now, it stands as part of the record." Tyrese leaned close to Snoop, his eyes wide. "That's it," he said under his breath. "That's the nail in the coffin." But Snoop shook his head, his gaze locked on Diddy. "Not yet," he said quietly. "There's more." He gestured for the clerk to continue. The next recording began to play, and the courtroom seemed to shrink in on itself as Diddy's voice filled the air once more. "We keep this between us," he said. "If it ever gets out, you know what happens. We both go down." The threat in his tone was unmistakable. A collective shiver ran through the room as the weight of those words settled over them like a heavy fog. Diddy's lawyer sat back down, his shoulders slumping as if he could already feel the verdict closing in. When the recording ended, the judge looked out over the courtroom. "This is significant evidence," she said calmly. "We will take a recess to allow the defense time to review these materials. We will reconvene in 1 hour." As the courtroom slowly emptied, the buzz outside grew louder than ever. Reporters scrambled to file their updates, their voices urgent and breathless. Tyrese turned to Snoop, a grin breaking through the tension. "You did it, man," he said. "You brought the receipts." Snoop just nodded, his face calm but his eyes hard. "This ain't about winning or losing," he said. "It's about the truth. And the truth doesn't care who's sitting at the top." Outside, the world waited for what would come next. The recordings had changed everything, no more speculation, no more whispers. Now, there was proof. And Snoop Dogg, standing in the middle of it all, knew that the story was far from over. The courtroom was packed again as everyone filed back in after the short recess. Outside, the media had already turned the recordings into the story of the year, snippets of Snoop's calm voice and Diddy's quiet threats played on a loop, dissected by pundits and fans in equal measure. Inside, the air was thick with expectation, every eye locked on the two men at the center of it all. Diddy sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his lawyer's whispered urgencies going in one ear and out the other. His fingers drummed that same restless rhythm, faster now, as if trying to beat back the rising tide of panic that threatened to break through his calm facade. Across the room, Snoop sat with Tyrese at his side, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and watchful. The judge called the court to order with a single rap of her gavel. "Mr. Combs," she said, turning to Diddy, "you may now proceed with your cross-examination." Diddy's lawyer rose, smoothing his tie with a motion that looked almost like a nervous tic. He approached Snoop with the cautious intensity of a man trying to steady himself on thin ice. "Mr. Broadus," he began, his tone deceptively smooth. "These recordings, assuming, of course, that they are genuine, paint a very selective picture, don't they?" Snoop arched an eyebrow, his voice calm. "They paint what happened," he said. "Ain't nothing selective about the truth." The lawyer pressed on. "But context matters, does it not?" he said, a hint of desperation in his tone. "Words spoken in private can be twisted, misunderstood, taken out of context to fit someone's narrative." Snoop tilted his head slightly. "You think I twisted anything?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "I just let the tapes play." The lawyer's face tightened. "Perhaps," he said, "but you have to admit, your relationship with Mr. Combs has been complicated over the years. Disagreements, rivalries, maybe even personal grudges. Snoop gave a slow nod, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You're right, he said. We've had our share of clashes. But that don't change what's on those tapes. The lawyer leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Or maybe, he said, this is just a chance for you to settle old scores. To drag my client's name through the mud in the biggest courtroom in the country. Snoop's gaze sharpened. You think I need a courtroom to settle old scores, he said. I've been in the game long enough to know better. This ain't about me, it's about what really went down. The lawyer hesitated, as if unsure how to push back against the calm certainty in Snoop's voice. Finally, he switched tactics. Let's talk about those recordings, he said. You claim they're authentic. How did you get them? Did you record them yourself? Or did someone else provide them to you? Snoop's expression was impassive. I recorded them, he said simply. I knew back then that one day, I might need to protect myself. Turns out I was right. A flicker of discomfort crossed the lawyer's face. So you were planning this from the start, he asked, his voice rising. You were setting my client up. Snoop shook his head slowly. I was protecting myself, he said. When you're in rooms like that, you learn to cover your back. And if someone's got a problem with that, maybe they shouldn't have said what they said. A hush fell over the room at the bluntness of his words. Even the judge seemed to pause, her pen hovering over her notes. The lawyer swallowed hard, his frustration mounting as he realized he was getting nowhere. He changed course again, his tone turning sharp. Mr. Broadus, you're a performer. An entertainer. How can we be sure that what you're saying here isn't just another performance? Snoop let out a soft laugh, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. You ever seen me lie on stage? He said. When I perform, it's all in the music. But this is real life. And in real life, I don't need to put on a show. The lawyer opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, he straightened, his shoulders stiff. No further questions, Your Honor, he said, his voice tight. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Would you like to redirect? She asked. The prosecutor rose, her face calm and composed. Just one question, she said. She looked at Snoop, her expression steady. Mr. Broadus, why now? Why bring these recordings forward after all this time? Snoop's eyes darkened with something that wasn't quite anger but burned just as hot. Because it's time, he said simply. Time to stop pretending. Time to tell the truth, no matter how messy it is. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone like a physical force. Outside, the cameras kept rolling, the headlines kept flashing, but inside, it felt like the world had shrunk to just that single, undeniable truth. The judge nodded. Thank you, Mr. Broadus, she said, her voice quiet. You may step down. As Snoop left the witness stand, the buzz of whispers rose again, a low hum of voices that filled the room with the sense that something monumental had just happened. Tyrese met him with a nod, his eyes bright with a mix of relief and pride. You did what you had to do, he said. Snoop just gave him a look that said it all. Ain't about me, he said. It's about the truth. Diddy sat at his table, his face pale but composed. His lawyer was already whispering strategy, but Snoop could see the tightness in Diddy's jaw, the flicker of something that might have been fear. The judge rapped her gavel once more. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments, she said. Until then, I expect no commentary outside these walls. This matter will be decided in this courtroom, nowhere else. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the reporters surged forward, their questions flying. But Snoop just walked past them, his shoulders straight, his face calm. Because in the end, he knew, he had spoken his truth. And now, it was up to the world to decide what to do with it. The morning of the verdict felt different from every other day that had come before. The sun rose slowly, its light filtered through low clouds that hung over Los Angeles like a shroud. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger, a chaotic sea of voices and flashing cameras that seemed to pulse with a single question. What happens next? Snoop Dogg arrived early, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, every camera trained on him, every reporter desperate for a quote. But he said nothing, his lips pressed into a thin line. He'd said everything he needed to say in that courtroom, and he knew that no matter what the judge decided today, the truth was already out there. Tyrese was at his side, phone in hand, scanning the endless stream of headlines and tweets. "They're saying the judge is going to rule today," he said in a low voice. "Everyone's watching, man. Everyone." Snoop just nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let 'em watch," he said. "Ain't nothing left to hide." Inside, the courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Every seat filled, every aisle lined with reporters who scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Even the jury box, though empty in this bench trial, seemed to echo with the weight of what was about to happen. Diddy sat at the defense table, his lawyer murmuring urgently in his ear. His face was pale but set, his eyes locked on the judge as she entered and took her seat. He didn't glance at Snoop, not even for a second, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. The judge surveyed the room, her expression calm but grave. "This court has heard testimony and reviewed evidence over the past days," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "What has emerged is a story of power, trust, and betrayal. And while there have been conflicting accounts, the recordings presented leave no doubt in the mind of this court that Mr. Broaddus's testimony is credible and corroborated." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Tyrese squeezed Snoop's shoulder, his face breaking into a relieved smile. Across the aisle, Diddy's lawyer slumped back in his chair, his face ashen. The judge continued. "Mr. Combs, the evidence suggests a pattern of manipulation and threats that cannot be ignored," she said. "This court finds that the allegations brought forward by Mr. Broaddus are substantiated." Snoop sat still, his face a mask of calm, but inside he felt a wave of relief, like a weight he'd carried for years was finally being lifted. Diddy, meanwhile, stared at the judge with a look that was part disbelief, part fury. His lawyer tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "Mr. Combs, you will have the opportunity to respond to these findings in the appropriate forum," she said firmly. "But for now, this court finds in favor of Mr. Broaddus." The gavel fell, the sharp crack of wood on wood like a gunshot in the silent room. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the whispers rose, soft at first, then louder, a wave of voices that filled the courtroom with the sound of a story that was already racing around the world. Outside, the buzz of the crowd reached a fever pitch as reporters scrambled to file their stories, the headlines already blazing across every screen. Diddy found at fault, Snoop's testimony vindicated. Tyrese turned to Snoop, his grin wide. "You did it, man," he said. "You really did it." Snoop just nodded slowly, his eyes on the door where Diddy was already rising to leave, his face a storm of barely contained rage. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Two men who had once shared secrets and stages, now on opposite sides of a truth that had shattered everything. As Diddy turned and walked away, the crowd parted around him, the cameras flashing like lightning. Snoop watched him go, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end. There would be more headlines, more stories, more battles to fight. But for today, the truth had won. The reporters crowded around Snoop as he stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, their questions flying fast and loud. "Snoop, how does it feel to have won? What's next for you? Do you think this will change the industry?" Snoop paused, the chaos of the moment swirling around him. Then he lifted his chin, his voice calm and strong. "This ain't about winning or losing," he said. "It's about telling the truth. And that's what I came here to do." The cameras caught every word, the footage already streaming live around the world. But Snoop didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the weight that had been lifted, the story that had been told. He knew the industry would never be the same, but that wasn't his burden to carry anymore. As he walked away from the courthouse, Tyrese by his side, the noise of the crowd faded behind him. The sky overhead was still cloudy, but there was a brightness to it, a sense that even the heaviest clouds couldn't hide the sun forever. For Snoop Dogg, the road ahead was still uncertain. There would be questions, backlash, maybe even retaliation. But he'd faced down bigger storms than this, and he knew that the only thing that mattered in the end was the truth. And in that truth, he found his freedom.